Hello and welcome everyone to Real Talk with Ms. Val. Today's topic will be on social media and its impacts. We're really excited to have everyone here today, and we're so thankful that you've chosen to join us for this special conversation. My name is Gloria Coe, and I serve as Senior Director for Alumni Career Engagement here at UCLA Alumni Affairs. And on behalf of all of us, we welcome you to today's event. The UCLA Alumni Association seeks to bring together our amazing faculty and alumni to help us navigate complicated and interesting topics. The Real Talk with Ms. Val series will feature guests that can answer some of our burning questions on topics such as navigating your career journey and finding balance. For today's event, Ms. Val will interview Department of Communication Professor Tim Groling and explore the interesting topic of social media. Many of you submitted questions prior to the event, and thank you for that. So we'll answer some of your questions throughout the program. So now I'm excited to introduce our two speakers today. Ms. Val is the former head coach of the UCLA women's gymnastics team, a position she held for 29 years, where she led her teams to 7 NCAA championship titles. Today, Ms. Val will be interviewing Professor Tim Groling, an expert on political communication and new media. He has written a couple award-winning books and previously served as chair of the Department of Communication. He has won awards for his teaching and is a student favorite and beloved communications professor. I'll turn it over to them now to start the interview.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Bruins. Professor Groling, thank you for joining us today. This is going to be so exciting. This is a huge topic. We're talking about social media. And I think that I'm the perfect person to moderate this because it's not a love-hate relationship, but I think that I speak probably for our audience that's here. There are times that I absolutely love it. There are times that it scares the pants off me. And there are times when I just feel really nervous about it and I figured out I get nervous because I don't know what I don't know about social media. And so we've got about 55 minutes now where I'm so excited, Professor, that you're going to help put all of our heart and minds at ease by helping all of us have a healthy relationship with our social media. So thank you for being here. And we're going to get started right away with one of the questions from one of our alum. It's from Shanna Gudovich. And she asks a very pertinent question, very simple, but pertinent. What does social media that's good for us look like?
It's a really good question. And again, thanks for interviewing. I think this is a really important topic. I think if we're going to understand what social media might be that would be good for us, it's important, I think, to know what people might be using it for and who the us is, because it might be lumped into the category of social media. People post their thoughts for friends or maybe a mass audience of strangers. People react to or amplify what other people say. They post their own creative content, videos, images, and stories and distribute them widely. A lot of it is consuming endless amounts of information and videos and content that others have generated. And it might be as simple as advertising yourself to potential employers or other people as well. The different sites that are out there, different social media sites have different levels of interaction and control and how much they are engaging people with their friends versus more of a strangers or other communities. And I think it's important to note, as with a lot of good things in life, moderation might be important. Too much of any good thing is not necessarily good for you. Steve Jobs famously called the personal computer like a bicycle for the mind. It basically allows people to do things that used to be much more difficult, far more easily. And social networks are like a bicycle for friendships and for social relationships. So things that used to be more difficult in terms of maintaining relationships and finding friends and exchanging information or other things that help you stay close with them are a lot easier, and it closes the distance between us in ways that are really fundamental. When social scientists talk about social capital, which is this idea that there are networks of relationships in society that help it work effectively, social media really have two areas that people think might be useful. One of which is bridging, allowing people to meet other new people that they wouldn't have interacted with before and be informed about things or be inspired by things that they would not otherwise have been able to perceive. So that could be an important benefit of social media. And of course, there's bonding social capital, a notion that if we have friends, this might be a tool to help us strengthen our ties to those friends and help support our friends and have them help support us in a way that might otherwise be hard to do over distance or because of other factors. And of course, as we can observe pretty easily, it's much easier in an era of social media to have people organize and conduct activism, working together to achieve a common goal and find other people who share those same goals. And finally, it would be really nice if social media would help give us a more accurate picture of our world, although as we'll talk about in later questions, there are some issues with that. So that's kind of in my conception of what the sort of positive impact of social media might be on society.
Okay, great. And I'm taking copious notes, so I hope all of you are as well. What are the ethical concerns that we have and the unintended consequences of social media? I just watched The Social Dilemma for the second time, and one of the gentlemen in there said that social media is basically a digital pacifier. And I thought it was a really great description at times. And so what are some of the things that are detrimental to us?
Sure. There's a Pew study, the Pew Research Center came out with a study just a couple weeks ago, and apparently 64% of Americans said social media has a mostly negative effect on the way things are going in the US today. And only 10% of the people who responded said it was mostly positive. So there's, I think, very good reason to be thinking that people are concerned about social media, and there are a lot of problems. So that, we should be concerned about. So of course, privacy is a big issue. We're using these platforms to exchange information with each other, with our friends that, we don't normally think about holding information back from our friends. And on these social media sites, of course, the companies then learn more about you and in a way that might be invasive. And it's important to note they aren't just observing what you say, they're observing what you do, your actual choices, the actual things you do, not just on the social media site. Of course, they can observe a lot there, but also on other sites around the web. So if you have a Facebook like button on a website and are doing something on that website, it's sending information back to Facebook about what you did on that site, whether or not you viewed that page, how long you stayed, things along those lines. And fundamentally, it's easier to manipulate people if you know more about them. People are complicated and have a lot of different considerations in their heads. And if you can know exactly what people think, you might be able to find a way to get people to change their responses or change their behavior without really changing what they believe, because you're emphasizing one aspect of it. So that is, I think, a real concern. And again, I mentioned before briefly the concern about misinformation. So it is very, very easy on social media for incorrect information to go viral. The old expression that goes back, 1700s, 1800s is that a lie spreads around the world before the truth gets its boots on. And if anything, that's gotten even faster on social media. Lies can spread extremely quickly and reach a huge number of people. There's also people who are motivated to actually spread disinformation on these sites, including potentially, foreign governments. And having that be spread by somebody that is not immediately clear as an agent of the foreign government is a new capability that might further spread disinformation in a society. There's also, even beyond that, there's a lot of negativity, and there's a lot of hate speech, and there's a lot of harassment and extremism and division on social media. Part of the reason why that happens is the quest for engagement that the sites are continually pursuing is in part because they want to keep people engaged with the content. They don't want people to be passively uninterested in what they see on the site. And it's easy, I think, to get people engaged if you put the type of more extreme content in front of them versus more neutral content. Ideas that are simplified to make them more palatable to people or that are appealing on an emotional basis are going to be more likely to potentially get a reaction on people than the boring truth, which is almost always more complicated. There's also, I think, a good reason to be concerned about an increasing concentration of power over information. So Google and Facebook and Twitter in particular, and to a lesser degree, Apple or other companies, have a huge influence over what information people are exposed to a degree we haven't seen in a long time. That sort of concentration of information power is something that people are concerned about, and I think justifiably so. And just as a I would call it a inadvertent or a accidental victim of a lot of this is that traditional news organizations have had their business model pretty well broken by Google and Facebook and Twitter. It is very difficult for those news organizations to compete in their traditional advertising market against these companies, which are really, really good advertisers and really effective at their jobs. So as a result of that, the sources of news and information we've come to rely on as arbiters of the truth are having much more difficulty making a business of it than they used to. So all those things I think are perfectly valid reasons to be very, very concerned about where we are today.
But do you feel that the information and the different disinformation age can coexist in the same space?
I mean, sure. We've always had information, disinformation existing. This isn't sort of necessarily unique about our time as much as it is how widely distributed it is and potentially the impact of it. You can think of misinformation and disinformation as being types of information. The key is quality. Some information is good quality and some information actually will make you worse off if you pay attention to it. And some is somewhere in between. The obvious solution and one that people tend to look at in markets is for good quality information to be rewarded and bad quality information to be punished or to be not consumed. But that's actually really, really difficult. And this is something we study a fair amount in both my classes, the political communication class, but also the one that's on digital information. There's a big problem with people rewarding high quality information, especially like news or such. The main problem that you face is the information that's most valuable to you is the information that's telling you something you don't already know. So you're really not able to judge the quality of the most potentially valuable information for you. If you're paying attention to information and you can judge whether or not it was true or not, then you wasted your time paying attention to it. You should have been doing something else with your time because you already knew that. So again, news is really, really valuable. Information is really valuable when it tells you something you didn't know and that you can't judge the quality of it because you don't know it. Conversely, it's really hard to know, and I think you even just said this explicitly a little while ago, to know what you don't know. So if you should know about something, but don't know that you don't know it, it's really hard for you to search for that or to sort of fill that hole in your knowledge because you don't know it's a problem. So those really make the rewarding of high quality information difficult for news providers, for social media sites, for a lot of different information sources. So unfortunately, a pretty reasonable reaction to this situation of not being able to judge the quality of news is to rely on other things to judge the quality of news. So you might not know whether or not you're being informed, but you do know that you're being emotionally engaged. You do know that a story makes you laugh. You do know that a story makes you sad. You do know that a story makes you angry. If you have that kind of reward and know for sure that you're getting it and have to choose between that and a story that you don't know if it's true or not, then people will tend to use their emotion, use their gut to make those choices and be reasonable to do that. Similarly, if you are getting political information and you don't know if it's true or not, you might fall back on partisan affiliation as a judgment for whether or not you should trust the speaker. So I don't know if this information is true, but I do know that this speaker is on my side and that speaker is on their side. So I'm going to listen to the one on my side. And again, that's a way to deal with uncertainty that people fall back on pretty easily. That's really a problem because you're not rewarding true information. You're rewarding information that's emotionally engaging and you're rewarding information that is on your partisan side. So solutions are kind of hard. So one thing is to try to make sure that your skepticism is appropriate. Again, you might not always know what you're missing, but you can sometimes tell when, especially social media is giving you an incomplete answer. Like if somebody's mocking an answer by a politician and includes a video, that seems to end abruptly, it's probable that they said something after they cut that part, where the politician said a much better answer that just was cut out. Or, you can think of also when somebody's asking you to think about one aspect of a story, what are the other complications or other parts of that story or a situation that are being left out? So always, I think, be appropriately skeptical and bring in your own information where you can. And again, if you are consuming information that makes you angry and makes you want to spread that information, give it a day before you actually do that. Because artificial urgency can drive bad decisions. And also, if you have been made angry or have been made to want to spread that information, somebody has wanted to do that. And you should be skeptical of that and should maybe, take a step back. So that's sort of general advice.
I love that, artificial urgency. I think that's very true. I think if we all took a time to step back and pause, to choose our responses versus reacting, I think we have a little bit of a better world. In this, in the documentary I just saw, as I mentioned, Social Dilemma, they showed a part from the Truman Show, and it gets into this next question that I want to ask. And the statement in the Truman Show was, we accept the reality of the world as we are presented through social media. And the piggyback to that, or the question that follows that, is how do we navigate our current situation with our social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, encroaching on our perception of our world around us?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, again, where if you consume information sincerely without taking a step back, it can really lead you astray. One thing that, a lot of people have observed is people feel worse about themselves when they compare their lives to the idealized version of people's lives that they see through social media. It's very biased, it's very filtered, it's very artificial, how people will present themselves on the platform. And if you compare it against your own life, you're undoubtedly going to feel bad about it. And this used to be a phenomenon that people identified with celebrities. Like when you would see a story about a celebrity having that wonderful life, and you would feel worse about your own life and be a little bit depressed. And now it's your friends who are kind of giving you this idealized version of their lives, or in some cases, celebrities on social media who are very carefully curating, very carefully, in some cases, editing their life to make it seem more attractive. It's kind of interesting. The old way that I think society used to deal with this was through tabloids. Like, I don't know if you've ever been shopping in a supermarket and seen this celebrity did something really embarrassing. This celebrity got really drunk. And they sort of go through and they take the celebrities down a peg or two. And it's mean and it's nasty, but I think it's kind of helping people realize that this is an idealized version of their life, but actually their real life is not as fancy as you think. It's not as ideal as you think, and might make you feel better. A little bit of shameful joy there. And if you look online, I'm sort of hopeful there's entire memes devoted to Instagram versus reality, for instance, that will show this really glamorous picture of somebody that they've posted to Instagram, and then show, well, you can see in the reflection here that they've actually edited themselves, and in fact, they don't look like that, and sort of tried to deflate that reality. And again, that's a little bit mean. I feel bad about that, but in some sense, it's a way to defend yourself against a manipulation of reality. So I sympathize. The other thing is a point that I mentioned a little while ago, recognizing that somebody who is showing you this information might have an interest in your response, might help you guard against being manipulated. Again, having emotion be something that deepens your engagement on a platform, and recognizing how needy the platforms can be for your attention might help you realize you need to take a step back a little bit. Similarly, in politics, it's sort of a truism in politics that getting people angry helps mobilize them. So if people are upset, they're more likely to be able to be pushed into taking some political action, whereas fear is demobilizing. If you make people afraid for some reason, they're less likely to get engaged in politics. So your opponents have an interest in you being fearful, and your friends, ironically, might have an interest in you being angry at somebody else, not at them. So, I mean, keeping in mind that people are trying to produce those reactions might help mitigate how much you actually do those things. In general, I'm very, very concerned about the power these platforms have to shape our perceptions of reality, especially, again, Google, Facebook, and Twitter. There have been academic studies, although they're hard to do, on things like how manipulated search results for candidates can change election outcomes. Just simple things like not even changing or producing incorrect information, but just changing where true information falls on a list and putting the information you want at the top of the list and less other information you don't want people to see further down in the same list. You might be able to change the information people have when they make their choices. And this has been true of news organizations, but it's especially true on social media when there are stories that are pushed to the top algorithmically versus not pushed to the top. That's a form of selection bias that can really be hard to deal with. Again, getting back to what seems to be a central theme of what we've been talking about, if the stories aren't featured, you don't know you're missing them. So again, knowing what you are not exposed to is really hard for us to do. There have been a series of experiments on Facebook measuring things like emotional contagion, like how much very subtle changes in what Facebook presents to people will have on people's moods and their attitudes outside the social media site. And again, because these sites are so huge and affect so many people, you can have effects on people's thinking outside the site in ways that are disturbing and unobtrusive and hard to know that you're being manipulated. So that's pretty worrisome. I don't like it. There's also third-person effects where people who are really engaged in social media might think that it's representative of the outside world when it's really not in a lot of cases. One example is journalists and politicians are very into Twitter. And it's an extremely active community on Twitter that spends a lot of time talking to each other, but not really talking to anyone outside Twitter, or at least not as many people outside Twitter. So that can be a bit of a bubble. And this is something that's a fairly recent controversy, and I would say we really actually don't know a lot about it. But I have conservative friends who are just livid about how Twitter has handled an election story that some people might have heard of, some people might not have, where the New York Post published a story about what they alleged was Hunter Biden's laptop. So Facebook said they would reduce distribution of the story until they had confirmed it was true, which is an unusual step. And then Twitter actually was blocking all distribution of the story. And again, from a news organization that's known to be kind of a tabloid, kind of a right-wing tabloid, but a legitimate news organization, credentialed news organization, and banned accounts that were posting links to that story, including New York Post site as well, and even would block direct messages between Twitter users to each other, not even posted publicly about that story, which is quite striking in terms of extremity. So, and again, this was because they considered it to be hacked material, which again, it wasn't clear how it met that definition. There's been lots of other allegations of shadow banning, where people are not having certain posts reach as far, but it's really difficult if you're outside the algorithm to know whether or not that's the case and to be able to prove it, because it's a bit of a black box, all of which I think serves to reduce trust in these platforms. So it's not a great situation for trust in these organizations.
So what do we do? What does a layperson like me do simply about that? Because right now I literally have gone off of all the social media platforms because they just got so ugly the last few months that it was making me like anxious inside. And I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name, but she just said, somebody wrote that she struggles so hard with comparison that she just got totally off of Facebook. How do we manage to be on social media in a healthy way when I'm sorry, I mean, as a moderator, I probably shouldn't say this, but there's so much I just don't trust.
Well, I mean, I would say that it's probably more of a problem if you do trust too much on social media. Like, you should go into it with some healthy skepticism. And honestly, one of the nice things about social media is it does tend to give you more of what you're asking for. Like, it really carefully will tend to watch your choices. especially the algorithmic ones like Facebook. And if you're choosing to react and engage with content that's really not healthy for you, it'll give you a lot more of that. So be very careful and very conscious of the choices you're making, and try to occasionally expose yourself to somebody you disagree with, or try to maybe wait a while before you would respond to something if you're really heated about it in the moment, or try to click on some cute cats every once in a while, and get more of that in your feed. Like the internet was built on cute cats. I think we need to get back to that a little bit. So
I agree with that. Okay, we've got a great question here that's going to be right up your alley, from Spencer Ituarte. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. How has the role of social media contributed to increased polarization in the American political landscape, and in what ways has it done so?
yeah, no, I sort of am going to apologize in advance, because this is right up my alley, and you always have to be careful you don't get too obsessed with because not everyone cares about as much about this as I do, I think, but I'll try to give you some context. So I think it's really important to have some context, which is the period of time right after World War II up until the 1980s was the time where a lot of our thinking about how the world normally operates, especially in social sciences. That's when a lot of academia really became like the modern system of academia, when a lot of important studies were done, where a lot of foundational thinking was done. And it's, where a lot of our sort of thinking about how the world should operate came from. And it was really weird. It's a really weird time. And I don't think people realized how weird it was. But just to give you a sense, this was a time period where you could find Democrats who were way more conservative than a typical Republican. You'd find Republicans that were way more liberal than a typical Democrat. And you had, as a result, the parties really not being that distinguishable from each other. Like the Democratic and Republican Party were different, but they were internally inconsistent and had weird members that weren't at all like each other in a way that I think is foreign to how we think about parties today. And there's a classic expression, I guess it's George Wallace in 1968, complaining that there wasn't a dime's worth of difference between the two major parties in the United States. There was actually a document put out by the American Political Science Association in 1950 called Toward a More Responsible Party System, that said we have to have stronger parties that are more ideologically distinct national parties in order for people to have a good ability to choose between them in elections. And be careful what you wish for, because we have really distinct ideological national parties now. Like that's something people were wishing for in the 1950s, and we certainly have that now. And I should also say that the news media during this time period were also very strange. And it's like the only time in history where we've had news media like this. They were professional, they were nonpartisan, and they faced very little competition. That is, you had local newspapers that were monopolies in their towns for the most part in the country, and you had broadcasters who were required by their broadcast licensing process to be neutral in politics because they were using the public airwaves. I tell my students in class that the media environment that we're living in now is more like the 19th century than it is like the 20th century. Like that 20th century was so weird. The 19th century is more of like what we're doing now. And it was very similar. There was partisan media in the 19th century. There was extreme competition for readers and publishing of fake news and yellow journalism, all of which would look very familiar if you went back to it compared to that news product people were getting in the 20th century. So political realignment and polarization has been gradual, but has been getting a lot more extreme now that we have partisan media, and social media seems to have turned it up to 11. The extreme version of this is actually not just disagreeing with the other party, but it's something called affective polarization, where you actually hate people, regular people who are members of that other party. The classic way that this is measured by social scientists is whether or not you would be upset if you found out a family member was marrying a member of the other party or not. And that used to be something that was extremely uncommon. Now it's extremely common to be upset about that. Part of what's made things worse is the filtered bubble phenomenon or the echo chamber phenomenon. People are increasingly muting or unfriending people who are expressing views they disagree with on social media. it's already normal for you to have friends who think like you do. That's just a factor of people living in the same community, being drawn to people who think like them in the first place. But the additional step that's happening much more commonly now is for people to unfriend or mute old friends because you now disagree with them politically. And I think a lot of us have had instances where we've been tempted to mute the high school friends or other people that we used to be friends with, but can't really stand their politics now. People who study this and study people's filtering of political information were originally pretty concerned that people would engage what they called selective exposure to political information, that they would go and avoid information that challenged their views and only seek information that reinforced their views. And they studied this empirically, and they found some people did that, but most people didn't. And it actually didn't really seem to be a problem because people didn't care enough to filter their political information. And it was too hard. When there were nonpartisan news outlets, you had to really work hard to find partisan news outlets. And you'd have to basically filter out a lot of the dominant news and only focus on a subset of it. So most people didn't do this. Now, partisan media is a lot easier to find, and partisan information online is super easy to, if you're searching for it, find it. But I think a critical difference is, again, algorithmically, once you start choosing to consume partisan information in your newsfeed, the system will automatically give you more of that. So you don't have to put in any effort. It will start doing that automatically and magnify the problem. So all these things, I think, have combined to make partisanship now much more extreme, much more extensive than it's been, with the recognition that the previous time was a weird one. And, actually we fought civil wars before. It's been pretty bad before, so.
Yeah, thank you. I'm seriously taking copious notes. We have another question from Shelby Hall, and I want to thank all of you that sent in questions. We thoroughly enjoy going over them. They're amazing. And thank you for those of you that just gave a shout out to Professor Groling for being here. That was really fun as well. And to those of you that are sending us questions, we've got a ton coming in. So that is exciting as well. And it's a tribute to all this information you're giving us, Professor. So thank you very, very, very much. This next question from Shelby is really important because I think so many of us use scrolling through social media as our downtime. It's our numbing out time. It's not something that we sit at our desk and say, I'm going to go through social media now. It's like, I just want to chill for a bit. And you pick up the social and you start scrolling. But she brings up a really, really good question, is how can we encourage our friends and family and colleagues to properly research information, which takes time, and misinformation in the media, so we can eliminate the fake news and spread, more times than not, the factual information. And I think that's such a compelling question because it takes time, and time is a currency. And how can you help?
I definitely sympathize, and it's a real problem when people do this. And I'll maybe not mention that I've had to have this conversation with some family members, and it's very delicate when they're your mother-in-law or such. But anyway, again, people wanting to and being interested in and loving to spread rumors, that sort of is a phenomenon that, of course, existed before social media. The problem is it's a lot faster, it's a lot easier, and it might look more credible than it did before when people are spreading these sort of stories, low quality stories online. I do want to point out, and again, I want you to, or I want to encourage people to be sympathetic to especially friends and family and colleagues, because I think the cynicism level generationally sometimes varies tremendously. Older people in particular might be more trusting of news or more trusting of media organizations because of the era they grew up in than younger people today. So I'll give as a personal anecdote. My father, this isn't strictly about fake news, but hopefully this gets the point across. My father's a smart guy. He's a retired engineer. We were visiting over the holidays one year, and on New Year's Eve, he came to me and said, I'm worried about an email I got. And it seems a little weird. He got an email from AOL. And again, just as context, he was an AOL internet user, which tells you a lot. And he had clicked on it to update his account information. And Coincidentally, it's told him his credit card was expired, and his credit card was expired on the account. He actually knew that, had been meaning to do it. Like, I'm delighted, this email has come in, and I will click on it. And he needed to re-enter his information. But then they started asking all sorts of additional questions and extraneous questions that concerned him. So he eventually came and asked me about it. And I'm like, this is a phishing email. This is not from AOL. This is very bad. But his reaction, which I appreciated, and it made me think, was, wouldn't AOL know that they didn't send this email and block it? Like, how did AOL, who runs this system, let this email get through when it's not from them? He thought that the fact that he was on AOL and the email said it was from AOL meant that it must be from AOL, or else they would have intercepted it. Like, that was his logic. And I can sort of see that. Like, if you're trusting of an organization to do their job competently, it seems like they should have blocked that. They should know it wasn't from them, but they didn't. So I want people to, give some due deference, I think, to people who are more trusting, because maybe organizations used to be more trustworthy than they are today. So fact-checking sites. I think fact-checking sites are excellent for non-political news, but for a lot of the reasons we've talked about already, it's hard to get people to trust a fact-checking organization that's associated with a news organization when they don't trust the news organization in the first place and think it's biased against their candidate. As context, politicians allege bias by the news media pretty commonly because it's a no-lose option for them. If they can make people believe the news media are biased against them, it makes bad stories hurt them less and good stories help them more. They should always allege that, because it doesn't hurt them. I should also say that I am somewhat knowledgeable in some areas and have had discussions with fact checkers who are checking facts in some areas. And I found that sometimes they're not very good. So sometimes they focus on a tangent or use a definition that's not standard, or are actually not doing the best job, or doing things like fact checking a parody account, which is a parody account. It does not need fact checked if it's a parody account, because it's a parody. I'm sorry, pet peeve. I personally think that if fact checking sites want to be taken more seriously on political issues, they should potentially have something like Fox and MSNBC do a joint fact check, and have basically two sides, in effect, almost be able to argue and reach a consensus on these things. And I think it would be persuasive if they did that. As it stands now, I think there's a lot of reasons why people who are suspicious of the media to start with aren't going to trust them. And then the other thing I would just say is, again, I referenced this earlier, make sure that you remember that they're your friends and family and colleagues, and that relationship is more important, presumably, than whether or not somebody is wrong on the internet, because somebody is always wrong on the internet. Like, if you let that get to you, you'll be bothered all the time, because somebody is always wrong on the internet. When I was growing up, my mom used to occasionally have conflict with her friends. And the sort of exasperated thing she would say, which I still remember, is, oh, but she means well. Like, that was always the most insulting thing she could say about any of her friends, was, well, she means well. I think actually that's a good message. I think that's a good, they do mean well. I think most people, everyone is sort of the hero of their own life journey. Everyone thinks they're doing things to help each other. So if you go into it with the notion that they aren't trying to misinform you, they aren't trying to do something bad, I think it might help you be a little more charitable and potentially influential in how you interact with them. Because if you attack people, I think people will get defensive, and that doesn't help anyone. Long answer, I apologize.
No, that was great. I have a few questions for you personally. First of all, Jack Lamb put up here that he just learned the term doom scrolling. I've never heard that in my life. Do you know what that means?
I haven't heard of doom scrolling. I'm going to have to get a definition.
Okay, Jack, put it back in the chat what doom scrolling means. Because
I assume it's people who are enjoying exactly how awful everything is on social media. And
okay, Jack. Second of all is doom scrolling. He's back.
Yeah. So endless procession of negative news online on social media. Yeah, you can definitely get that if you want it. That's if you want it, you'll get more of it. So.
Okay, second of all is I just got through reading this really great book. It's called Humankind. And it actually, the researcher actually goes through our history and shows us example after example after example that humans really are kind. Like our nature isn't to be mean and ugly and horrible. And it's like you said, your mom said, well, what did she say? She didn't really, that wasn't her intention.
She means well. That's what, whenever she was unhappy with somebody, well, she
But
means
it's
well.
the truth. It's like, especially the way we communicate now, which is ridiculous, to think you're gonna have any type of a resolution over texting or Twitter or Snapchat or whatever else they do. But I always just tell my student athletes, you know what, can you just give her the benefit of the doubt that her intention wasn't to hurt you? Can you give me the benefit of the doubt that my intention wasn't, that, and I think we've lost a little bit of that because we're doing so much of our communication over this way of typing and characters that's not how we should be communicating.
It's very easy to depersonalize others if you've never met them, if you have no context. Like it is something that might make you feel good to have an enemy. Like have more purpose in your life because you're fighting against this other person.
Right. I have a question for you with what you teach your students. I believe that education and knowledge is power. And the more I'm educated on social media and everything, I said I don't know, the more confident I feel to use it. Do you notice that the students that come through your classes, do they switch their social media behavior once they're through with your class? Do they have that aha moment that they're in control, that social media is not in control of them?
Yeah, we have, especially in one of my classes, a lot of projects the students can optionally do, and then they write, and we use them as basis of discussion for the class. So we've had various ones with different names, but one was like called Cold Turkey, where they are supposed to not engage with social media at all for 3 days, and then see how it affects their life, or not look at their phone when they're talking to other people, which different experiences like that. And for a while, I will say the thing that discouraged me was the students would say, yeah, actually I got a lot more done. I felt happier during this time. And, it really seemed to make a difference. I'm like, so are you going to stop using it? Like, no, it just went right back to it. But I think recent students actually seem to have, through various channels, maybe even by watching things like The Social Dilemma, they do seem to be more willing to put guardrails on their behavior, or to start imposing limits and some self-discipline on what they do, and delete some apps that are especially consuming their time when they can't afford that, or that they have a hard time otherwise dealing with. So again, I was planning on talking about this a little bit later on, but the thing that's really struck me among the students is we've been talking about Facebook since it was the Facebook, back since the very earliest days of Facebook, when it showed up on the UCLA campus. My students have wanted to talk about it in class, and their attitudes towards Facebook over the years has gone from like obsession to, I would say an abiding love, to currently they kind of hate it. Like they view Facebook the same way that a lot of people in my generation view email, which is you have to have it. It's an important communication tool, but it's not really where your heart is. Like it's a tool. It's a tool you have to use, and they use it for organizations and maybe keeping up with relatives a little bit. But for the most part, they've moved on to other platforms and kind of don't like Facebook. So there is, I think, an evolution. There is a reaction that people can do, and with enough feedback, enough information, I think eventually they change their behavior.
You brought up guardrails and the social dilemma again. First of all, did you agree with everything that was said in the social dilemma?
So the social dilemma, I mean, I'm always a little bit suspicious of a documentary that involves actors and actually really good actors. So that's sort of sensationalizing things a little bit. And honestly, there was a bit of a tension in that movie between the people who are the main sources. That was, I would call it maybe a little bit too self-important and self-congratulatory about how good they were at doing this kind of manipulation. Frankly, I think evidence from social sciences, they are, with some except the advertising side, is actually pretty good and pretty effective. But a lot of the other things they were talking about, their models are not that great and maybe have peaked a little bit. So I think that they're overstating in that documentary exactly how much they accomplished in terms of that manipulation, and how much they are potentially regarding government regulation as a good solution for it, in part because I would expect these large organizations would just capture the regulatory process and use it to discourage rivals and further entrench their position. Personally, I think that, I was gonna say, I just really think maybe using antitrust power, using anti-monopoly powers on the part of government might be the proper way to deal with some of these organizations.
The part of that documentary, and that really hit home with me was actually the end. And you mentioned something about guardrails. And I love the fact that at the end, they do enumerate some of the guardrails that are already part of our phones. You know, you can put a time limit on how much screen time you have or how much screen time your children have. And did you find that part of it useful?
I agree, and kind of want to find a clip of just that section and make it mandatory, because that was, I think, the best part of the movie by far. And I think that it really, there's some nice practical advice there that people would use.
Right.
You know, restrict.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I agree. And I'd love, like, if you're not going to watch the whole thing, just fast forward to like the last even 5 minutes, 5-10 minutes, whatever. There were a lot of good suggestions for monitoring yourself and your children on social media. We have one more question that I want to get to from Claire Matienzo, and it's, what are the long-term issues associated with social media? And how do concerns about social media compare to concerns about other new communication technologies such as Zoom meetings or channels like Slack or Discord?
So I'm going to veer off a little bit and say part of what I want to do is compare them to other old communication technologies, because every time there's a new communication technology, there's a period of adjustment and panic, actually, that people have to deal with. So, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when video games became a thing and people were obsessed with, oh, it's going to make kids more violent. Oh, it's going to ruin people. They're spending too much time doing it. Online video games, these massively multiplayer online games, television, you know, all these things that have happened in the past, I think, have been reacted with a period where people thought that the initial reaction was going to be the permanent reaction and humans wouldn't adjust. I think humans actually adjust a fair amount. So I try to tell my students, imagine what the world would be like if you were told we're going to get rid of all digital communication. You're going to have your only major source of information be one of 3 channels that are all showing basically the same thing over broadcasting, where you have to just sit there and watch it passively and have reduced engagement with friends and communities while you're doing that. And that the content of this is going to be the most bland, inoffensive thing possible that will not court any controversy and will not offend anyone. And you have an hour and a half of news per day, and the journalists will basically uncritically cover what politicians said. That would be horrifying, but that was the world we lived in that post-war era. It was a really terrible thing for society. And, you know, people like Huntington have studied that by diverting so much time into passively watching TV, it ruined a lot of America's sort of secondary associations, people getting together and achieving things. It sort of isolated people in a way that was horrible. And I think that social media is much better than that on a core level, and much less of a concern, because it was giving more engagement to people. It is giving people more power over their information, for good or for ill. Some of the things we talked about before are good, some are ill, but fundamentally a different relationship than was the case in that time period. Like, I don't know if you had the experience of being angry about news coverage or angry about a story. I was actually angry about a story that appeared in a newspaper at one point in the 1990s, early 1990s, and wrote a very long letter to the editor that the news organization decided not to publish. And that was their prerogative. That was completely within their power. And I had no ability to respond to them. Like, they had done something that I still think was wrong. And when someone criticized them, their choice was to not tell anyone that somebody thought what they did was wrong. That was their choice. So having a more even playing field and giving individuals more power right now is, I think, useful. So a lot of what's happening now is, we were previously in a period where it was a monologue, where things were being said to you. And now it's much more of a dialogue where people have at least a little bit of voice and ability to affect the outcome compared to previously. Now, I am much more worried about the political side of our future than I am on the social side. I mean, I think that people do adapt to this technology. I show my students in my political communication class news from 1968, and they're bored and horrified, and then they laugh during the commercials. Because the commercials, if you watch them from the 1960s, despite what Mad Men would have you believe, were terrible. And they were terrible because they didn't have to be good. They didn't have to be good at all because television was new and people hadn't adapted to this new medium to recognize how they were being manipulated in very obvious ways in retrospect. And today when you watch it, I sort of, I mean, it's hard to tell you about commercials from them, but they were terrible. I'll just tell you, they were terrible. So I think that it's a bit of an arms race where people are always adapting and not passively just consuming information. I think that you have to account for that. And I think that people will build up defenses and people will adapt if it ends up being something that's systematically bad. Again, shifting from Facebook to other platforms that might better protect their privacy or might cause them to not lose jobs in the future because people will uncover what they said publicly previously. Some of my students, we had a unit in the class recently where they use screen time, which again is something you can use on Apple phone or their equivalent Android devices that'll tell you in a weekly report how much time you've spent on the phone and what applications you've spent doing it. And they realized, you know, I'm spending too much time on TikTok and deleted it. And then we're able to move on from that. So I think that, again, there are ways if we help encourage people to be thoughtful about these things that they can change their behavior. And again, I would much rather have my children or any children today on social media applications than just passively consuming TV for 5 or 6 hours at a time, like I honestly did when I was their age. I mean, it's a much more fundamentally social activity, and I think that's a good thing. And then the other thing I would note is I think there's a focus on the bad things, but this generation, Generation Z, my current crop of students, I was telling them this in class the other day, they are far better at processing information and coordinating than prior students I had. I've been doing a different version of the same project in that class. It's really complicated, really involves a lot of information processing and coordination and decision making that has to be done collectively. And when I started teaching that project in about 2010, I had to spoon feed my students and tell them, okay, you might want to set up a Google Doc and you might want to use this reference tool and you might want to make sure you have each other's phone numbers so you can get in touch with each other. And now it's like, here's the task, like, yeah, we got it. And they have the tools and they have this ability to coordinate and work together online in a way that I think is basically like breathing for them. So now, you know, there might be a degree to which that might be making them not as self-reliant as they once were. An example of that is it's very common in classes today for students to potentially organize a common set of notes. And, you know, some lectures, there'll be a Google document or some other document that is open during the lecture, and students are typing in notes and then sharing those notes with each other and correcting each other's notes so that at the end of it, they have a really perfect set of notes for that lecture. And that's good because it's working together, but it's also bad because taking your own notes and sort of thinking through the process of what goes in the notes and what doesn't go in the notes is actually important for you to own and process the information yourself. So, you know, I sort of have had dialogues with the students about this strategy and try to make sure that they aren't overestimating how much they're getting from something that's handed to them versus something that they earn themselves and produce themselves. So anyway, that is, I feel like I'm going almost into our Q&A time, so I feel like I should stop.
No, I totally agree with that. One of the questions that came up in the Q&A that I think is amazing, that we need to answer, we all need to know this. Can you speak, and we don't have a lot of time, but can you speak to the pros and cons of conversing on Messenger or Twitter private messages? And are those conversations safe?
Well, no conversation is safe if you don't trust the other person you're having the conversation with. So, I mean, there are in the headlines today, lots of examples of people that are leaking private conversations that were one-on-one to another person. I would say that Gmail is the one that maybe people aren't aware of how much is being observed by Google when you're doing that, to build a model of you for advertising purposes primarily. That's something that my students are almost all huge believers of Gmail, and I think are a little bit too trusting in their use of it. But personal messages back and forth on, especially if the site has end-to-end encryption, which some do, is certainly more secure than posting something publicly. But that's stuff that can come out. There was I guess I can talk, a cheating case in my department where students were exchanging information about an exam on a social site, and then it came out later and the students were disturbed to find out that in fact, yes, that was something that could be used to show that they cheated during the exam. So yeah, you have to be careful because another student turned them in.
Wow. Monique Crabiel, excuse me if I've mispronounced your name, has asked, what are some reputable fact check sites? Boom, boom, boom.
So Pointer, and I apologize, by the way, because their names are all so similar, I sometimes mix them up. I've been using Snopes since like the early internet days. I love Snopes from way back. The Pointer Institute, I believe they're called PolitiFact, is I think better. I'm actually not fond of the Washington Post. And if a news organization only does occasional fact checks and doesn't have dedicated staff to doing it and isn't transparent in showing you the stories that they chose not to fact check, then I trust them a little bit less. So if a news organization just does a one-off fact check of an article without actually having a history of doing it, I don't think there's any real reason to trust that, because why did they choose that story? It's, again, a case where the allegation of selection bias is very hard for them to deal with. I just want to say, oh, I see some of my former students in the chat. Hi, Chris.
Hey, they love you. That's so cool. Well, thank you so much. This has been extremely eye-opening. Thank you so much, Professor Grueling. So happy something. So happy to be able to, okay, keeps, like all these comments are coming in now. Sorry, I can't get to them. But you are absolutely beloved, and we're thrilled to call you a Bruin. Yes, Professor Grueling is the best. Athena, I think that was you. Glad to see that you're doing well, Professor. Yeah, dang.
Some of them haven't seen my quarantine beard, so that's I think they might all be appreciative.
Great. Okay, well, thank you to the UCLA Alumni Affairs for putting this on and organizing all of this. This is always so much fun. As I said, I feel the Bruin love come through the computer every time I do one of these. And I just want to say that when we reached out to Professor Grueling, he was like, yes, I'm in. There was no hesitation. Didn't even ask what day and time, and gave us quite a bit of his time to prep for this, to make sure that we had questions that covered a wide range. So I hope that you all felt that you got a really great amount of information from this. And like we said, to be able to go to those fact check sites, like he said, is it Snopes, Snopes?
That's right. Snopes is the oldest and most broad one, I would say. They cover a lot of things that aren't necessarily just news. Okay,
thank you. Someone just said, thank you, Valerie. I love being called Valerie. So thank you for putting it up there. I want to say we were thrilled that Professor Grueling started us off with this next series of webinars. And I get to tell you who's going to be here in the next few months. Okay, so get ready for this. Our next guest in December, the first week of December, is going to be the one and only, well, drum roll. This person is one of the greatest leaders in history whom I've ever studied. And I study a lot of leaders. She was the head of Paramount Pictures for 25 years. It is the one and only Sherry Lansing. And in prep for that, I'd love for you to go get her book. It's called Leading Lady. And it's a really quick, fun read. But she's going to be here. She's a hoot. And we're going to have a great time. And I think that's going to be the first Tuesday in December. And then after the first of the year, we're going to have a very, very dear friend of mine whom I've worked with for over 30 years at UCLA, Dr. Bill Parham. He's a sports psychologist. He was the head of our CAPS department here at UCLA for many years. He went on to work with the LA Lakers. He's teaching now at Loyola. And the last few years, he was put in charge of starting the health and wellness community within the NBA. And so he's doing a lot of work with that. And I noticed there were a few questions that came up about the micro and macroaggressions about race on your social media accounts, and from even friends, and whether you should just delete them or not, or unfollow them or block them, whatever. And I think he will be a really great person to address questions like that too. And then we're giving you a bonus session this year. The following month, we're going to have my leadership coach, whom I hired back in 2009, and who since has worked with our team, many at UCLA softball, still works with them, a few other teams around the country because the country has found out about him. But his name is Foster Mobley, and he's going to be here to just talk to us about leadership. So super, super fun times with UCLA Alumni Affairs. It's great to be a Bruin. Thank you again, Professor. All of you be well, be safe, and go Bruins.